Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining Project Power. Project Power is funded by the Rehabilitation Service Administration. Project Power supports parent centers in Region D2, Arizona, California, Colorado, Idaho, Nevada, New Mexico, and Utah to strengthen services and supports for transitioning youth and young adults. To get the best experience, please keep your mics off unless you ask a question. You will be muted for most of the presentation. Please use the chat to ask questions. We will answer them at the end of the presentation. If you'd prefer to ask your questions out loud, please use the raise hand function in the reactions section at the bottom of the screen. We also have closed captioning available. This webinar is being recorded, and we will send out the recording along with a resource and a survey for you to fill out. We will also put a link to the survey in the chat 5 minutes before the end of the webinar. Today's session is From Campus to Career, Accessing Accommodations. Our facilitators will be Vicki Ortiz and Shayna Lang. Vicki is a certified employment support professional and a graduate of both the Association of People Supporting Employment First, Emerging Leaders in Employment First Professional Development Program, and the National Leadership Consortium on Developmental Disabilities Leadership Institute. Vicki is a past president of the Colorado APSE chapter and is a current board member and policy liaison. Vicki is vice president of the National APSE Governing Board. She is also the policy committee chair of Colorado Neurodiversity Chambers of Commerce. Her educational background is in human development and family studies with an MS in family studies. She is currently enrolled in the University of Colorado Denver's graduate certificate program in policy, entrepreneurship, and advocacy. She has presented nationally on supported employment and employment first and provided consultation and technical assistance to organizations. Vicki has lived experience as a woman and as a vision for all people with disabilities to fully realize, pursue, and accomplish their employment goals. Shayna Lang is an inclusion advocate for students with disabilities within higher education. With a master's degree in special education and a graduate certificate in disability services in post-secondary settings from Ball State University, she is passionate about establishing inclusive college pathways for individuals of all abilities to reach their full potential. Her experience includes coordinating college students, success services, ADA compliance, and accessibility for students with disabilities across several settings. Shayna now serves as a program manager for IN, a Colorado-based nonprofit that advanced inclusive college pathways for students with intellectual disabilities.
All right, wonderful. Thanks, Melissa. And thank you so much to Project Power for having us. I know Shayna and I are both equally excited to be here. And yeah, welcome to campus or From Campus to Career, Accessing Accommodations. This is kind of a part 2 to a presentation we gave on disclosure earlier in the year. And I know that Melissa will be able to provide information on how to access and go back and view that recording. I won't go over everything again, but again, my name is Vicki Ortiz. I'm a curriculum developer and trainer with the Colorado Office of Employment First. My email and LinkedIn information are here in case you'd like to reach out or connect with me. I also like to share in this space that I do have that lived experience as an ADHD woman, professional, wife, mother, all the things, just meaning that I have both autism and ADHD. So I'm always kind of presenting from that lens as well. And just to provide a little bit more about the Colorado Office of Employment First, our vision is to create a culture of inclusive, meaningful, and competitive employment for all people. And we do that by elevating equitable employment nationwide for all people with disabilities through our pillars of collaboration, systems innovation, and training excellence. We sit within Colorado's UCED, University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities. Every state has at least one UCED, and JFK Partners is ours. So we sit within JFK Partners, which is within the University of Colorado School of Medicine at the Anschutz Medical Campus. Our website is here if you'd like to learn more about us. We do offer a comprehensive array of training and services to equip organizations and professionals in providing the highest quality employment first supports. And just to go over a little bit about what Employment First is, at its core is the belief that everyone can work if they want to with the right support and that no one is excluded from pursuing their employment goals. We also believe that opportunities for employment exist at any stage of life, whether that's, coming out of high school, transition, whether you're in your 80s or 90s and want to pursue employment for the first time, it's possible and achievable for everyone. Um, and so it's really about changing systems, shifting that culture to elevate expectations and create pathways to meaningful employment for all people. And at the federal level, employment first is really defined as that expectation and opportunity, that preference for people to be able to work if they're receiving publicly funded program supports and services from publicly funded staff. So that should be the expectation, not something that folks should have to fight to opt into pursuing. Um, Competitive integrated employment, if you hear me talk about that, just means three things. It means that people are paid at or above local minimum wage, that people are integrated into the workforce, meaning they're working alongside people with and without disabilities, and not just the integration piece, but that authentic inclusion and belonging as well. And finally, that there are opportunities to advance and be promoted just like anyone else. With that, I'll turn it over to Shayna.
Awesome. Thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm Shayna Lang. I work for In Pathways to Inclusive Higher Education. Want to encourage you to reach out to me if you have any follow-up questions after what we discussed today. I want to be a resource to you in whatever path you're pursuing when it comes to accommodations in higher ed. To give you just a quick overview of who I am and the organization that I work for, you can go to the next slide for me, Vicki. So IN works to establish inclusive college programs for students specifically with intellectual disabilities across the state of Colorado. These types of programs called Inclusive Post-Secondary Education Programs or IPSEs, they exist all across the nation. So there's some resources for you all at the end of the slides to look at what's in your region. But really our vision is that students with intellectual disabilities and ultimately for the purpose of this presentation, all abilities would be welcomed on college campuses and able to pursue their future goals in academics and social engagement, independence, and career readiness. And our heartbeat as an organization is to make sure that that happens all across the state of Colorado. So real quick, what is inclusive higher ed? For students with intellectual disabilities, traditionally those that do not meet college entry criteria or receive really intensive support from special education in their K-12. Inclusive higher education is kind of this next step of access in higher education for students who require more support. It provides accommodations and modifications that leads to a credential, a certificate credential. Most of what we're going to be talking about today is accommodation. So if you hear me talking about what's available in higher ed in the accommodation bucket, but you think myself or a student that I work with might need more, then you can reach out to me for the inclusive higher education options and what other supports exist. Right now, we only have 8 programs in the state of Colorado serving students, but we get to enroll about 120 students with intellectual disabilities statewide. It's an alternative admission process, and Vicki, you can just kind of go boom, boom, boom for me. Yeah, they're fully included, but they're participating all across campus inclusively in all of the academic, social, independent living, and career readiness. And then they receive much more robust support in 4 pillars, which is this next visual you'll see. This kind of gives a breakdown of the 4 pillars of support. There you go. Yeah. And this is within inclusive higher education programs. So again, this is kind of the next level of support for students with disabilities in higher education. We're going to talk about the foundation of what exists in higher ed today. Do you want me to take a deck? Yeah, okay. So for today, what we're going to really focus on is reviewing the foundational policies that shape access to accommodations both in education and in employment. We're going to work on reframing and defining what accommodations mean in those spaces. We'll explore types of accommodations and how to request them. And then we'll review a few scenarios surrounding those 2 places. And then we'll walk through available resources and hopefully have time for questions for you. So I'm going to kickstart before we jump into accommodations in higher education and then employment and in the workplace. I want to make sure that we're reflecting on most of the time students with or individuals with disabilities when they're in their K-12 experience, they are accessing services under IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And what we don't want to spend a lot of time here, but I want to make sure that you know that when students graduate from K-12, they're moving from the supports and the resources available under IDEA and moving into the ADA in Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. And that's really where our guidance comes for accommodations after they leave the K-12 system. So in K-12, under IDEA, this is for students who have a wide range of disabilities. They get access to free, appropriate public education, least restrictive environment. And what's really critical here is that there is a child find system where IDEA empowers schools to go find the students that have disabilities and have needs. They kind of seek you out to provide the supports that you need to be successful. Once leaving that space, that K-12 space, and leaving that IDEA as the governing law, you're stepping into now the ADA, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which moves from focusing on success for students with disabilities to just ensuring that there is equal access. So that's a really big verbiage change when we talk about accommodations post K-12. Accommodations are intended to create equal access. They do not guarantee an individual's success in those spaces, but they definitely provide support to help you have the most chance of success. But that's a really big change of framing. Another component that I just want to highlight when you're moving into higher education under the ADA in Section 504, there is now protections around the individual with a disability that they don't have to disclose or share information with family unless they want to. And so you'll see that Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act falls under that ADA in Section 504, where students have to say, I want this information to be shared with families or other people in my support network. And so those are two really big things, that level of protection, but also that shift from success to access. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like in the day-to-day.
All right, wonderful. And so I'll talk a little bit about the ADA just as kind of a refresher, reminder to set the foundation for everything else we're talking about today. According to Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, reasonable accommodations mean a modification or an adjustment to a job or a work environment, or the way things are usually done during the hiring process. So covering the span of recruitment, hiring, onboarding, performance management, that whole employment journey. And so the purpose is really to enable that person with a disability to have equal opportunity or access, as Shana mentioned, to get a job. And so they are set up for success, but again, doesn't guarantee that success. But to make sure they have the right tools and resources and training, things like that in place to fulfill those expectations of the employer, and reach those outcomes just as a person without a disability would be expected to reach those outcomes. The ADA requires reasonable accommodations as they relate to three different aspects of employment. I kind of alluded to it already, but equal opportunity in the application process, enabling a qualified individual with a disability to perform the essential functions of the job, and that's with or without those reasonable accommodations relevant to the job at hand and the nature of that person's disability and their needs. And making it possible for an employee with a disability to enjoy equal benefits and privileges of employment. So access to all facets of employment, be they physical, social, benefits, all of those pieces. All right. And Shana, yeah, I'll let you go ahead and jump into reframing and defining accommodations from the education lens.
Yeah, and you'll kind of see Vicki and I are going to pop back and forth. I'm going to speak to the education space. Vicki's going to speak to the employment space so that you hopefully feel equipped for whatever you're walking into. So to reframe the purpose of accommodations in the education, particularly in higher education space, again, it's to provide equal access. So we want to make sure that any limitations or barriers that are posed by a disability does not keep you from being able to participate equally in college coursework, college campus environments, those kinds of things. Because of the ADA and the 504, it is legally mandated that all institutions of higher education, whether they be public or private, have some form of dedicated office or personnel that are able to support you receiving accommodations. So those offices often are called accessibility services or access office. Sometimes they're called disability services. So there's a few different names, but at any institution, no matter how small, there's either going to be a dedicated office or a person that kind of has a role of overseeing accommodations. And within that umbrella of overseeing accommodations, they're going to support a wide array of a documented disability. So it might be physical, it might be cognitive, it might be mental health related. And so it doesn't matter which category you fall into, you can go to the designated disability office or personnel and work through their process. And we'll talk about what those processes tend to look like. But what's important is that colleges must provide appropriate accommodations to students, both in the academic setting and just across the campus, unless doing so causes undue hardship or requires a fundamental alteration of the curriculum. So you're going to hear a lot in higher education that you have to meet course essential functions, or you have to meet the essential functions of the course or the activity that's in place. And if an accommodation would shift those functions, those essential components, then it might be considered not an appropriate accommodation. Vicky's going to talk through what that looks like in the employment space, but it's very similar in higher education that it is pretty rare that an accommodation would actually be considered a hardship or undue hardship to an institution. By and large, they have the infrastructure built out where accommodations are fairly reasonable to access. So we can talk about some of those experiences, but most of the time they're going to be looking at and they're going to be talking about how can we provide appropriate accommodations. And where we want to draw the line, again, from that IDEA to ADA, is that aside from inclusive higher education programs that I talked about at the beginning, the foundational support in higher education is access to accommodations only. You are not, in general, going to be able to access modifications to college coursework. And I'm going to talk a little bit about those differences here. So accommodations, just to make sure we understand our terms, accommodations is alterations to how your learning happens or how it's shown, but you're doing the same learning as any other student. So again, it can't alter the course essential functions. So common accommodations would be extended time on an exam. You're still taking the exact same exam, but you have a little bit more time to do so. Maybe it's doing it in a private testing room or utilizing text to speech where they can read the exam aloud to you before you respond. You're still taking the same test, meeting that same essential function as any other student in that class, but you're doing it in a different way. Whereas modifications are alterations to what learning occurs or to what degree the learning occurs. So sometimes it's limiting the length of assignment or exams. So if you take out a few questions, you're no longer doing the same exam as the peers in that course, and that would be considered a modification. Maybe you use an alternative format. Instead of writing an essay, you submit a PowerPoint slide. That would be considered a modification to the original intent of that assignment. And so modifications typically are available at a little bit more easily accessible way in K-12, but in higher education, you're going to hear accommodations only, so that we only are addressing how your learning is shown or how it occurs. So under this, it's important to know when you are accessing accommodations in higher education, you have rights as a student that are a little bit different than when you were in K-12. One of the big things is huge on confidentiality. So when you disclose and you go to the Disability Services Office and you work through your accommodations process, they will ask you explicitly for a diagnosis, and we're going to talk about that. But you are not required or expected to disclose that diagnosis to anybody outside of that process. So your teachers don't need to know your diagnosis. Peers don't need to know your diagnosis. You have the right to disclose that when you see fit or if you see fit. What teachers have the right to know is what accommodations are required to help you have equal access. So they don't need to know the backstory. They just need to know what's required of them to make sure that that access is available. Also, it's important for students to know that you have confidentiality in your courses. Under the ADA and 504, institutions or faculty members should not be identifying you as a student with a disability in a class. Nobody should really know that you're accessing accommodations. That should be taking a really interactive one-on-one conversation with faculty or key staff, but you have the right to confidentiality of your needs. You also have the right to equal treatment. So even if you're receiving accommodations, your professors are expected to treat you equally to the rest of your peers. That includes holding you to the same high standards, but also not making sure that they're treating you with the same amount of respect and integrity that we would expect of any other student in their class. And if those things do not take place, you have the right to access a grievance process to say, hey, I feel like this was not kept confidential, or I did not receive equal treatment. And there is a grievance process outlined at every institution. On the flip side of your rights, you also have these responsibilities, kind of this shift in a lot of ways from K-12, that you are now expected to be holding yourself to a high standard. You're going to follow the code of conduct and the procedures that are set out at that institution. You're expected to meet those essential functions. The accommodations do not ensure your success. That's on you. And if you do have updates to your accommodations or to your needs, it's your job to advocate for that. So you have to provide that updated accommodation letter, advocate for your ongoing needs, because they do not, like the IDEA, have to come find those and serve those needs. You have to start that conversation and you have to be the one self-advocating. So it's important to know that there are both rights that you have and responsibilities when you step into accommodations in higher ed. And really quickly, because I think sometimes we have some misconstrued assumptions of what it means to receive accommodations in higher education. I've worked with lots of students that said they received accommodations in K-12, and then when they got to college, they just wanted to try it without accommodations. And that is absolutely your choice. You're allowed to choose that. But I really encourage folks to think about it in a proactive way. When you start the accommodation process, you have access to proactive services rather than reactive. If you're getting to the middle of a class and you feel like you're floundering and then you try to get accommodations, that's so much more reactive and chaotic and doesn't set you up for as much chance of success as possible. So the benefits are that even if you get started with the accommodation process, they're ready to rock and support you whenever the time is right. And so that allows you to be more proactive. You also always have the choice when or if you utilize accommodations. You could go through the accommodation process and decide you don't want to use accommodations in one class, or you do in the other, or you want to wait until next semester. All of that is fine. You get to choose when those things are implemented, but starting the process allows you to be ready. It's also a preparation for the workforce. You're going to hear from Vicky the way that you can access accommodations in the workplace, and practicing that in a supported higher education environment can be really beneficial. And then it also builds in that continual practice of advocacy and self-disclosure, which is going to be essential for whatever path you take after your educational journey.
I'm coming. Sorry, too many buttons. All right, awesome. Thanks, Shayna. And what a great setup for talking about accommodations and employment as well. And want to start out by defining what reasonable accommodations are not. And this is a notion that's out there in the world, and you may or may not hear it. Sometimes the perception, the myth is that reasonable accommodations provide special treatment for people. And they are not a form of special treatment. What they really and truly are productivity enhancers. So it allows a person to be productive, to meet the expectations of the employer, just like anyone else would have to meet those expectations, but with the tools and resources and supports that are going to help them do that. And so the idea is that every person should be able to meet those core functions, fulfill those responsibilities and core functions of the job with the support they need to do so. So thinking of, again, not accommodations as special treatment, but as productivity enhancers and pathways to fulfilling those expectations. So as we look at then the definition and purpose of reasonable accommodations, again, it's any change to the application or hiring process, to the job, to the way the job is done, or the work environment that allows a person with a disability who is qualified for that job to be able to perform those essential functions of the job. Again, as Shayna kind of outlined earlier in the accommodation versus modification piece, both of those can be kind of wrapped up in here, but really accommodation being, hey, we're giving you what you need, the how, right, to be able to perform those essential functions of the job. I didn't realize I had animations in here. All right, awesome. For the purposes of accommodations, who is a person that has a disability? And so, as a reminder, the ADA definition of a person with a disability is an individual with a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. Medical proof may need to be provided if a disability isn't obvious or isn't an apparent or visible disability. Employers are allowed to request medical documentation from a healthcare provider to verify that need. There's also a part of the ADA in terms of someone being quote unquote regarded as having a disability. People who are perceived as being regarded as having a disability are not qualified for reasonable accommodations. And where that plays in is someone who's regarded as having a disability or perceived to have one or treated as though they have a disability, they are protected from discrimination, but that does not automatically qualify them for reasonable accommodations. Hopefully that makes sense. So if someone's mistreating you because they think you have a disability or in their mind you have a disability, whether it's been disclosed or verified or not, you'd be protected from discrimination, but that would not be the same case for the reasonable accommodations. All right, so what are essential functions? When we use these words, essential functions of the course or of the job in this case, what does that mean? Essential functions are job duties that are fundamental, core, if you will, to the position. They are the reason that the job exists. And so if we were to take those away, the nature of the job, the core of it wouldn't be there. So some considerations around, hey, is this an essential function, a core function of the job? So considering whether the position exists specifically to perform these essential functions. Is the whole reason why this position exists to accomplish X, Y, and Z, to accomplish a certain task or cover certain responsibilities. Also considering the number of other employees who are available to perform the same job duties. If we are looking at, for example, modifying a job, which would mean looking at the what is being done. If taking out a component of the job, is it able to be reassigned to someone else? Or would that mean that that core component is not getting done? That core function is not being performed. So looking at that piece as well. Is this the only role that covers those pieces, or are there others as well? And also looking at the expertise and skills required to perform those essential job functions and what that looks like. So all of those would be included in determining what's an essential function, what's not, what would be more of a marginal function of the job, if you will. And there will be links on the bottom of some of these slides so that you're able to click in and dig in even deeper if you'd like to learn more. Oh. All right, and so we've talked about undue hardship a little bit. Shayna gave some examples from the education lens. So for purposes of employment, talking about undue hardship in that an accommodation would be costly, extensive, substantial, or disruptive to those essential functions or to the work environment, or might fundamentally alter the nature or operation of the business. And so again, with undue hardship, it may vary from scenario to scenario. It's not always a black and white, okay, this is and this isn't. It's going to be based on several factors that would be taken into consideration. And again, it's typically pretty uncommon to see that something would be considered undue hardship, and we'll talk about that in just a moment as well. But considerations include the cost of the accommodation. And not just the cost objectively, but the cost in relationship to the size of the employer. So are they a small employer, a larger employer? Are they a family-owned business versus having corporate offices and a broader structure, infrastructure? What are the financial resources of that employer as well? A $500 accommodation to one employer may not be very much versus a smaller business that is a considerable percentage of their resources. So the cost in through the lens of size and financial resources as well. Also looking at what is the nature of the employer's business, what are the number of employees, again, looking at who holds that role, how would that impact that team, those roles, things like that. And then, of course, as I mentioned, the impact on the business's expenses and resources. There is a link at the bottom of this slide where you can learn more about undue hardship as well. But it will be a case by case depending on the nature of the scenario of the request and the characteristics of the business. If an accommodation is determined to be an undue hardship, employers must try to identify another accommodation that will not pose such a hardship. So it's not just, hey, this is an undue hardship, that person then moves on. No, that employer is responsible to identify another option that will satisfy that person's needs and accommodate them that would not impose that hardship. They must also consider other methods of funding, available tax credits, and also give that applicant or that employee the opportunity to provide or pay for their own accommodation if it's deemed as an undue hardship. So let's talk a little bit about the cost when it comes to accommodations, because I think there's lots of myths and misconceptions about the cost of implementing employment accommodations. Um, Typically, and these numbers have even gone down actually, these are the latest numbers we have from 2023 from the US Department of Labor. And cost for accommodations is typically quite minimal, relatively speaking, or non-existent. So the average cost for a one-time accommodation, so meaning that the accommodation is needed to be implemented and then is not ongoing. Once it's implemented, it's there, is only about $300. The number used to be 500, and that's actually gone down. Nearly half of all accommodations are free. It's more of that willingness, not so much to invest financially because it's, free, but that mindset of we want to be an inclusive employer. We want to make sure that each and every one of our employees are equipped with what they need to pursue success, to fulfill those core functions of the job. And so they don't cost any financial resources at all. And then the median annual cost for just accommodations in general, so the amount that a given business is spending on accommodations across all of their workforce, is $3,750, and only 1 in 14 employers actually incur ongoing costs. So lots of times these accommodations, what they look like are schedule flexibility, working remotely versus being in person. I need to leave early to go to a doctor's appointment. I need a stool to sit on for breaks. I, need to be able to sit while I'm cashiering at some point. Lots of different ways that that can look where it's minimal or no cost at all. And lots of employers are already accommodating employees with disabilities and they don't even know it. So yeah. And so just to take a look at why employers who are implementing reasonable accommodations, why are they even making these available? And it's to retain valuable employees. When a person with a disability is hired not for their disability, but for the qualifications and the strengths and things like that that they can contribute to the business, what we call a really good job match between what that person has to offer and what the needs of that business. Um, we want to retain that relationship, right? And we want to set that person up for success. And so employers are accommodating people with disabilities to retain those valued employees who are contributing to their business. Also, 68.4% of employers said that accommodations made were either very effective or extremely effective. And typically, that's not just for the person who requested the accommodation, but lots of times accommodations can make things better for the whole team, help things run smoothly, build better relationships, things like that. The direct and indirect benefits of making accommodations includes retaining those valuable employees, as I mentioned, improving productivity and morale because people feel valued. When they feel valued, they engage more. When they engage, they perform. Reducing workers' compensation and training costs and increasing workforce diversity. It's boring to work someplace where people are all the same and everyone's just like you. We want to work places where we can learn from each other and grow together and have some fun too. And with that, we're going to talk about then the different types of accommodations, and Shayna's going to take over from the campus perspective.
Yeah, and before I actually jump into these, because I think Vicky really set this up, but there's a concept called universal design. Specifically in education, we talk about as a universal design for learning, but it can be universal design principles across any sector. And what Vicky had mentioned is a lot of employers are naturally already accommodating needs. And universal design is kind of that concept where we think of changes or adaptations or accommodations we would make for somebody with a disability or a particular need actually benefits the entire community. So, for example, when you have a ADA door opener button, right? Beneficial for somebody who is a wheelchair user. Also beneficial when I'm walking with my two little ones and I have so many grocery bags. That also benefits the general population. And so a lot of times you're going to see universal design starting to take place in workplaces where they have these kind of naturally built-in accommodations where you don't have to go through a very direct process to get one. The same is starting to become true in higher education. More and more educators are starting to think of how can I create open-ended time for my students to show what they're learning rather than making them feel like they're on a time crunch, unless it's an essential function of the career they're pursuing. And we're starting to see more and more classrooms and just higher education campuses start to adapt that universal design, which is really encouraging for you, hopefully, as an individual or somebody supporting an individual with a disability going off into higher education or employment. For those things that are not naturally embedded and you do require that accommodation process, I do just want to point out that there tends to be three buckets of types of accommodations in higher education. The biggest one that we talk about most of the time is going to be your classroom or your content accommodation. That's more of that academic piece. So, but I want you to think beyond just assignments. This can include things within the classroom itself, like preferential seating. So maybe if there's a visual impairment, you can have a written accommodation that says, I'm allowed to sit in this space in this classroom because that's what's best for my vision so I can fully engage with the content as the rest of my peers. It might be a note taker in your class, whereas maybe sensory processing can be really difficult. And doing multiple things at once can be really difficult for your engagement. You can have either a peer note taker providing anonymous notes to the professor that then come back to you, or there's some note-taking devices like pens that record your course and you can go back and find the exact moment that a professor said something. Really, really wonderful assistive technology to help in those spaces. There could be closed captioning if you need that for a professor. You might be able to access closed captioning during a class where it's reading it right to you, right in front of you so that you're not missing any of those pieces. So not just assignments where you can get extended time or flexibility with your timeline of turning them in, but also in the class itself. What about that classroom environment do we need to make sure that you have equal access to? Another big category is testing accommodations. Most institutions have their own testing center. And this is where students with disabilities or prospective students that are taking pre-college tests would come in and take tests. So it's not just explicitly for people with disabilities, it's for all students with a variety of needs. You can have a private testing environment. You might be able to be assigned a scribe to read the test questions aloud to you or to write out what you dictate. You might be able to have extended time on those exams or even have breaks scheduled out. And a lot of times there's added procedures to taking tests in a testing center, but that is a really common accommodation that's provided for students with a variety of disabilities. The third bucket is housing and environmental. So beyond just the academics, I want you to think about when you go to higher education, what other spaces am I going to be on campus that I might need equal access to? So that might be door openers. We want to make sure that every single college campus has that for wheelchair users. Or it might be approval or a process for service animals or emotional support animals in the dorms. It might even be a meal plan adaptation if there's something that you need in terms of your health for access to meals. And so there are a variety of ways to access these different accommodations. It'll all go through the same person or disability office, but I want you to think a little bit more broader than just, am I getting extended time on tests? Think about really what is the impact of my disability on day-to-day life in my college environment, and what should I be advocating for in all of these components?
All right, wonderful. And so when we translate that into talking about accommodations at work and the different types, whether or not an accommodation is reasonable will vary according to the position that the employee holds. Again, it's not just objective, it's taking into a variety of different traits and factors about the scenario, but really it's how the disability affects that person's, again, ability to do and fulfill those core functions of the job, the environment that they work in, the expectations of the employer, all of those things. For some people, their disability may not have an impact on the given role, and so no accommodation is needed, even though they do have a disability. So it's really looking at, okay, what are the functions of the job? What am I responsible to do? How is my disability, if at all, going to impact any of those tasks that are related to the job? And it maybe need accommodations for some components of the job, but not for all components of the job. So it'll be really thinking through that, and we'll have some resources for you to help you think through that as well. So when we talk about different types of accommodations within the workplace, we can talk about physical changes. So things that Sheena has mentioned as well. Is there a ramp that needs to be installed? Is it modifying a restroom, making sure that there's an accessible restroom for folks with disabilities who would need to use it? Modifying the layout of a workspace. Is there room for a wheelchair to get through? in the way that the workspace is set up? Is it like in more open floor concept, or is it difficult to navigate? Is there Braille on the wall if someone reads Braille, things like that? Is there reserved accessible parking for people that might need it? Do you have a parking spot that meets the physical needs of your disability, for example? Accessible and assistive technologies. I love talking about this piece too because there's just so much out there that's always evolving and being introduced. But yeah, taking advantage of accessible and assistive technologies, making sure a computer software is accessible, for example, whether that's with screen reading software, if you are using like a voice to text sort of thing, voice dictation for working with the computer, knowing uh, different ways to make it more accessible for whatever it is that you're working on or responsible for doing on the computer. Using different technology to facilitate communications with colleagues who are deaf, whether that's video phones or ASL interpretation, making sure that that's available on meetings or really anywhere that that's needed within the workplace. Could be other changes to equipment, could be use of smartphones and apps, things like that. And that's where we see just everyday technology come into place as well, versus like assistive technology, which is specifically designed to support disability needs. Everyday technology can help us out too. Maybe it's a note-taking app, maybe it's something where you can create a list or a step-by-step guide. Maybe you just need to take a screenshot or a snapshot of something. There are a ton of different apps and things like that that are used to support employees in the work that they do. Accessible communications, kind of overlapping with some of the technology pieces. Again, that sign language interpretation, closed captioning at meetings and events, Braille materials, even something like adjusting font sizes, types, colors. Maybe if you're like myself, you process things better when they're in a bullet point form versus having huge chunks of paragraphs to read. That can be really overwhelming. So even saying, hey, can I break this down? Or to combine it with technology, can you feed it to AI and it breaks it down for you into a more readable format if it wasn't given it to you in that way. Um, and then providing materials in advance as well for people who want to have time to process and consider and be able to use those materials to also identify additional accommodations as well. And then policy enhancements as well. Perhaps there's an accommodation around allowing a service animal in a business setting, but they have a no animals on, on the workplace type of rule. So is there a way to look at policy and say, hey, okay, this policy stands, however, there are exceptions for when it's related to an accommodation sort of thing. Again, flexible and adjustable work schedules. Is there room for some flexibility and negotiation within that policy of like, hey, I can do all the core functions of this job, but I do have a standing medical appointment that I can't move on Wednesday mornings at this time. Can we be flexible? And I make up that time either elsewhere during the week or at home, I can make it up, that sort of thing. Performing work remotely, whether that's, hey, I'd like to request an accommodation for part of the week working from home, or can this role be fulfilled entirely at home so that I can meet my self-accommodation needs and receive any services and support that I might need at home as well. So not exhaustive of all the different possibilities, but just to give you some ideas of the different types and what those could look like. Oh, and I forgot I added this job performance slide as well because just talking about performance expectations and management overall as well. Having a job coach, if you're familiar, if you've heard of having a job coach, that is an accommodation. A lot of people don't know that, but to be able to have a job coach to support on the job, outside of work, at home with that remote work, whatever the case may be, that job coach is a reasonable accommodation under the ADA. So that's something I do always like to underscore because not everyone knows that, especially employers. And part of a job coach's job will be to work with employers and help them understand that as well. Changing, again, the presentation of tests and training materials, similar to being on a campus, being able to take a test in a way that is accommodated to perhaps your learning style or your communication style, things like that. Providing feedback through writing, whereas maybe a performance review might be primarily a dialogue, but hey, this would be better if I could see it in writing, or vice versa. Or I want to have my review to look at while you're talking to me. I'm going to process that through multiple means. Sometimes it looks like job reorganization or modification or reassignment, depending again on the essential functions, the nature of the business, and the request. And we have a couple, I don't know why it's starting with example 3. But sorry about that. But I do have a couple examples real quick of just what this could look like in real life. So let's meet Marcus. Marcus is a retail stock associate and he has an intellectual disability, frequently losing track of when he has multi-step duties. So if there's a task he has and there's multiple steps involved, that can elude him a little bit and he can kind of get lost in those processes. So to accommodate him, his supervisor replaces vague verbal kind of instructions with laminated step-by-step cards. There's a step on each card. They're laminated into a checklist. There's a visual icon for that task. He also uses a dry erase marker to check off when he's completed those items, and it allows him to easily resume his work if interrupted. He knows where he left off and won't get lost. So that structure, so sorry, something just fell in my office. That structure, an adjustment enables him to independently and efficiently complete his job functions. And then Anna is a retail stock associate with an intellectual disability who struggles to learn the new inventory sequencing system. So to accommodate Anna, sorry, that should say her employer allows an external job coach, because a job coach is a reasonable accommodation, to attend the shifts for the first couple weeks, more intensive job coaching, providing wraparound support and training so that she can learn the new scanning process and break it down into manageable steps and help practice until she can complete the task independently. So a strategy is put in place that is person-centered to her learning style, even though we are wanting to achieve that outcome of learning the scanning process. And so this temporary on-the-job support of a job coach allows Anna to master that new workflow and successfully maintain her position. And we'll talk a little bit about how to request an accommodation, starting with on campus.
Yeah. So it's important to know, again, I'm going to call back to the difference between K-12 and higher education. This is a very different process. It requires a lot of autonomy, self-advocacy, and self-disclosure. So you heard Vicki mention that there was a previous webinar about disclosure. We encourage you to check that out to really understand what disclosure looks like in higher education or the employment place. But I'll just set this as a reminder. In order to start the accommodation process in higher education, you have to go first. You have to self-disclose or self-advocate. And we want you to do that to the dedicated accessibility office or personnel. So oftentimes on a website for an institution, you'll be able to find, you can search up access, accommodations, and you can find which office that belongs to. Or you can go to the front desk and say, hey, I'm looking for the accessibility center, a disability office, and they can help guide you. From there, they're going to have a set policy of how you initiate conversation and connection with that office. Most of the time, they're going to ask you for an intake form where you are supposed to provide your documented disability. So every accommodation is provided only to those that have a documented disability. Some institutions might have a little bit more flexibility when it comes to that term and what that means, but by and large, they are going to request some form of documentation that identifies clearly what your diagnosis is. Most of the time, if they are asking for medical determinations, they are wanting that to be within the last 3 years. That is not all the time, because I know some of our diagnoses happen years and years before, but that tends to be the best practice and the most common. So if you're coming to the end of your K-12 career and you're thinking about, do I have updated diagnoses or diagnostic information? That's a worthwhile thing to start looking into with your medical team. IEPs and 504s do not automatically count as diagnosis documentation. They serve as wonderful background information, wonderful historical information for the people determining appropriate accommodations for you in higher education, but they are not automatically counted as your documentation. Some institutions, and I would say more and more, are leaning in the direction where they do accept that as documentation because you go through such a thorough process to get it in place in K-12. But at the larger level, that's not always the case. So I do want you to be thinking about not just what's stated in your IEPs and 504s, where they're going to be looking for a clear stated diagnosis and the impacts to your learning or to your environment, but also think about what medical diagnostic information do you have that you could provide. And I do point out that the regulations might differ across each institution. So make sure that you are finding that on their website, looking at what their details are. But by and large, these are the things that you're going to be expected to submit to prove your disability. Okay, and then from there, it's not just giving them information and hoping that they give you what you want. It's a very interactive process. So they'll take that initial intake form or information that you provide and schedule an intake meeting with you to discuss your educational or disability related needs. So it's not just looking at, you have this on paper, so I'm going to give you this accommodation. It's asking you, what has been the impact to your learning environment or to your campus environment in the past? What has worked? What hasn't? What accommodations have you had in K-12? Did they serve you? Did they not? So it's very interactive, and I really want to encourage any self-advocate to make sure you know what services you had in K-12. You know what accommodations or modifications you access so that you can communicate with your higher education staff in the disability office. You want to then identify and advocate for the accommodations that you believe are appropriate for you. Again, remembering that they cannot modify or alter essential functions of courses, but you can absolutely ask for that extended time on exams or a private testing environment or assistive technology. Or you can simply sit down and say, I have no idea what would help me. Here is the impact that I experience day to day. What are some recommendations you might have as an Accessibility Center staff member? They're going to have lots of history and background to be able to provide some ideas to you. And then it's important in that intake meeting to make sure you understand the protocols and the next steps because it is different. In K-12, a lot of that stuff happened without you, right? So they then communicated with your teachers. They put all of your accommodations and modifications in place for you. It's very different in higher education. You become the leader. So once you have this meeting, appropriate accommodations are determined. You understand what they're going to look like. You ask your manager, your case manager of sorts in the disability services office, then they're going to provide you a new accommodation letter. This is not an IEP and not a 504. IEPs and 504s mean nothing to college faculty. They have no idea what those documents are. It frankly would scare them if they received that. So please do not provide those to your faculty. Those go just to the disability office as you're providing your intake information. The new accommodation letter is going to be provided by the institution. It's going to be clear, and it's only going to state what accommodations are required. It's not going to state your diagnosis or any other unnecessary information. And what is important is that you then, as the student receiving accommodations, get to determine when you implement them. So you would go to your faculty and say, here is my accommodation letter, my approved accommodations for this class this semester. How are these going to be implemented? Let's have a conversation about it. You can email it to them. You can bring it to them in person. You can schedule a meeting with them. There's a lot of other ways to engage with your faculty or the staff members that might be needing to do these accommodations for you. But it's important that you take ownership of it and that you have the confidence to say, I have these accommodations in place and I'm so excited to access them so that I can show how successful I can be in your course. Okay, and so some things just to consider in this process. This is not a one and done process. It takes some time. So there is often the student that waits until midterm exams to start getting their accommodations in place, and there's not enough time, and you have to take your midterms without those accommodations. There are no retroactive accommodations. You have to have gone through the process, met with your disability services office, received your accommodation letter, communicated that with your faculty members before they can actually produce the accommodations you require. You are going to want to maintain open communication with your disability office staff. So maybe accommodations aren't being implemented well in some classes. You can go back to that disability office and say, help me advocate, help me figure out the best way to do this. And they can even help you communicate with your faculty. You tend to have an annual review with the disability office to say, how are things going? Is this working? Is this not? It can be a living, breathing document, that accommodation letter. So you can continually advocate for new things based on what limitations or barriers you're experiencing due to your disability. And then remember that there's going to be procedures. So as I mentioned, the testing center might have their own procedure. You might have to request your space in the testing center 2 weeks before you have to take that exam. So maybe make it a practice to ask the disability service staff, what are those protocols that you want to think about? Is there a timeline for my housing accommodations or for my meal plan accommodations? Make sure you have those kind of awareness of those procedures because there is more time that it takes to put these in place. But once they're in place, they serve you.
All right, wonderful. Let's talk about the process of accommodations and requesting them at work. So here are some considerations, and the process may look a little bit different depending on the employer, their size, the formal processes they have in place, things like that. But similar to the higher education piece, you need to initiate that process. The employer is not responsible to come to you and say, hey, do you need accommodations? Nor can they single any one person out and say, do you need accommodations? Because that may be perceived as discrimination. They can include like a blanket statement that everyone receives in the job description or as part of orientation, things like that. But they cannot presume and approach you to say, hey, do you need accommodations? So you need to initiate that process. Um, you will also want to engage again with that dialogue with the employer. What does that look like? Two people might have the same diagnosis, but experience the world in the workplace differently. So, like Shayna was saying, what's been working for you, what doesn't work for you, you know yourself really well and what works for you. And if you don't, you can have that dialogue with the employer. If you have a job coach, they can help you navigate this process and help you identify what accommodations are going to be the best strategies for you and what's going to be best to implement to set you up for success and fulfilling the employer's expectations. So it should be a dialogue with that employer. Um, Always make sure that requests are in writing. Many employers will already have like an accommodations request form or process in place. If they're a smaller business or like a family-owned business, they may or may not. We will definitely give you links to some resources, including like an accommodations template and a planner for like how do I determine what accommodations I need. You could have a template kind of already in place to be able to copy paste or to hand to that employer if they don't have something in place and say, hey, I need to request an accommodation. Here's what I'm requesting. But the phrase is, if it's not in writing, it didn't happen. You want to have that in place to go back, have it be the living document to figure out, okay, how can we adjust this a little bit to make it even better for you? Is it not working anymore? Or if there is a situation where you need to say you're being denied your accommodation by a manager or someone, you can go back and say, hey, I have this in writing. We need to look at this. I'm able to have this accommodation to help me meet your expectations. And I've seen employees and I've seen job coaches take approaches of doing it without it being in writing more informally. That may work with one leadership team, but then another leader comes in and they're not as supportive or as inclusive, unfortunately. And so having that in writing will help maintain that consistency and that you're going to get that approved accommodation as management changes and turnover happens, things like that. Um, Obtaining health documentation. Again, employers may ask for records related to disability, just depending on what it is you are requesting and asking for. There are circumstances where you may not need to disclose the disability specifically, but just speak to, hey, here's how I would be supported on the job. It's really going to depend on all of those different factors that we've talked about. So you get to decide how much you're disclosing, what's needed to know. Are there some pieces that I am disclosing because I want to disclose on principle versus like they need to know to provide the accommodation? So there could be different reasons for disclosing, but you may be required to provide documentation in order to secure certain accommodations. Selecting those effective accommodations, we'll give you a resource for that, but thinking through all the different types, how your disability has impacts and interacts with the different responsibilities you have on the job and making selections around there. And again, not doing that in isolation if you need the support of your job coach or the employer. Maybe they've accommodated someone in similar ways before. Maybe it's just talking to family or trusted friends that you might have, or someone else that you trust in your personal network. Again, accommodation processes, just like on campus, at work, they should be reviewed and ongoing. And if that's not getting done, practicing that self-advocacy of, hey, I want to go back, I want to look at this, I want to make sure things are still working well so that it's not just serving me, but it's ultimately serving you, the employer. And so that I'm able to meet your expectation and be productive, and all of those pieces. So as mentioned, a couple resources that you'll be able to click into, we have the links for, there's a job accommodation template so that you can start preparing. So a sample request form for employers and a sample request form for the hiring process as well. So kind of before and after that point of job acceptance. And there are a ton of other resources on the Job Accommodation Network. That link will be in the resource flyer that we have for you as well. And that brings us toward the kind of the conclusion of our time together and talking through accommodations. We just wanted to walk through some of the resources that we have for you. We kept this in here from the previous presentation that we gave on disclosure, so closely tied to accommodation, and they work together. And so we wanted to make sure that you had access again to this disclosure worksheet from COEF. You can print it. There's a fillable option to help you understand, okay, do I need to disclose? What do I need to disclose? Who needs to know it? All that sort of thing. So some good preparatory work and dialogue around disclosure to help set up the accommodation discussion. Project Power also has an accommodations planner to help think through, okay, like how is my disability affecting the job? Going through all the different areas of work, whether that's social, physical, all those sorts of things. How is it affecting it? And walking through some questions to plan for requesting those accommodations. And so these two worksheets, I think, in addition to if you want to have that request template kind of side by side so that these worksheets around disclosure and accommodation can work together and then feed right into and inform that template. I think they go together really, really well. So that is available to you. We have also put together, we're not going to go through each one of these right now, but in addition to the links on these slides, we've also put together a handout that has federal and state-specific resources, both education and employment related to go through, but there's some federal resources and just places to go for more information. Generally speaking, across states, you have your vocational rehabilitation agencies that provide funding for employment supports. Some states have employment first offices and initiatives, independent living centers, disability law organizations, advocacy agencies. Shayna, did you want to mention any like state to state education resources that are
Yeah,
out there
and
as
on the
well?
next slide, you'll
Oh,
see
yeah.
there's a link
Perfect.
to Think College. So Think College is they're kind of a host for inclusive higher education, so some of that next level support. But they have lots of resources on their website as well, just for the differences between IDA and 504 and ADA, just to help you prepare for that transition to college. And in that Think College, there's a national resource where you can see where are there inclusive higher education programs that provide even more support for students with intellectual disabilities. There's a handout from Think College on there, which is the differences between high school and college. That one's really good for like just practical preparation, difference between FERPA and IDEA, and then some more information on that section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act.
Wonderful. And so that brings us to our conclusion. We really appreciate your time for tuning in with us. Our contact information is here on the screen. Please do reach out to Shayna or I if you have questions, more that you want to discuss or dig into on the education or employment side. And you can also sign up for our communications if you want to keep up to date on what's going on in the education and employment world. You can use those QR codes to do that as well. But we just want to say thank you very much. We hope this was helpful. And don't forget to go back and check out that disclosure webinar as well. And Sheena, did you have anything else you wanted to say in
No, I
closing?
just want to echo a thank you and yeah, that we're a resource for you as you navigate the accommodation process. We know it can feel daunting, but we hope this helps you feel equipped and kind of eases that overwhelm and makes it feel like a really manageable and effective and beneficial next step for you.
Wonderful. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vicki and Shannon, for sharing such valuable information with us today. And thank you to everyone in our audience for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us. Before you log off, please take a brief moment to complete the feedback survey. Your input is incredibly important to us and helps shape our future training materials. As a quick reminder, a recording of today's webinar, along with all the presentation resources and handouts, will be emailed and uploaded to our learning management system, LearnDash, within the next few days. Thank you again for being here and have a wonderful rest of your day.